IFG webinar on last week's local and mayoral elections across many parts of England. So over the past few days since polling day, there's been, of course, a huge amount of discussion and commentary about the political significance of the earthquake election results of May the 1st, of the causes and implications of the rise of reform, the decline of our two-party system, what the results mean for Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch and their grip on their respective parties, and whether at some point before the next election, Ed Davey will finally run out of ridiculous campaign stunts. I think the answer to the last question is no. For the others, we will have to wait and see. But this is the Institute for Government, not the Institute for Politics. So our focus in today's event will be a bit different. And along with my three expert colleagues, whom I'll introduce shortly, our focus over the next hour or so will be on the implications of those election results for the government and its policy agenda, including its commitment to devolution, its plans for local government reform, for house building, net zero, and more besides that. And then we'll also be discussing the new regional mayors, their plans for office, to the extent we know what they stand for, the challenges they are likely to face, and more broadly, the state of local and devolved government in this country. So that's our plan. We'll also have, I hope, quite a bit of time for questions from the live audience. So anyone watching online, you can submit questions to us using the Slido function, which should be visible on your screen. You can also vote for other people's questions, so I can see what you collectively would like us to prioritize in our conversation. So joining me, as I say, are three colleagues from the IFG research team who are scattered across the IFG building in different cubby holes and nooks and crannies. And I'll let them all introduce themselves and say who they are. So Matthew, over to you first.
Hi, I'm Matthew Fright. I'm a senior researcher on the Devolution team, and I definitely lucked out in the room I'm in today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Matthew, down in our lovely conference room. Stuart, over to you.
Hi, Akash. Yeah, thanks. My name's Stuart Hoddinott. I'm a senior researcher in the public services team at the Institute.
Great to have you with us as well, Stuart. And last but not least, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Routley. I'm a research assistant in the Devolution team here. I'm delighted to join you.
Great. So yeah, welcome all. So we'll get into the conversation proper in a moment. First of all, just a quick recap of the results for, I guess, anyone who's not paid attention to the news very much the last few days. So what exactly happened? What is the context for today's conversation? So last Thursday, voters in many parts of England, though fewer than originally planned due to local election postponements in a number of places, elected in total 4 regional mayors with devolved powers, 2 directly elected council leaders, so different species of mayor, 24 local councils, which includes 14 county councils, 9 unitary authorities, and the oft-forgotten Council of the Isles of Scilly, as well as the new MP for Runcorn. And I mean, the headline story, of course, that everyone's been talking about was really the rise of reform in many of these contests. So we saw the reform candidates win the regional elections, the mayoral posts on either side of the Humber. We'll be talking about those 2 new leaders shortly. They also came second in all of the other 4 mayoral elections, both the other 2 regional mayor contests and the 2 local authority mayoral elections as well. Reform also took control of 10 councils outright, and they're now the largest party on a further 4, I believe, councils as well as winning, of course, the by-election in Runcorn. Liberal Democrats did well too, taking control fully of 3 councils and making gains elsewhere. Labour, meanwhile, lost about 2/3 of the seats it was defending and the only council in Doncaster that it held. But it did narrowly hold off the challenge of reform in the west of England and the Doncaster and North Tyneside mayoral elections, while the Conservatives lost control of every single council they were defending, but did manage to regain control of the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough mayoralty and the combined authority there that they led up until 2021. So that is the context for our conversation. And I'd now like to bring in our panel to talk us through what those results mean and the implications, as I said, for the government and its plans. So Matthew, I'd like to come to you first. Tell us about the 2 new reform mayors up in the north of England, how they won, what we expect them now to do.
Certainly. So first off, it's a big moment for the Reform UK party. They're the first party to not be either Conservative or Labour and in charge of mayoralty. The first first mayor is Dame Andrea Jenkins. She is a former Conservative MP. She's been elected mayor of Greater Lincolnshire with 42% of the vote on just about 30% of the turnout. Now, Jenkins had a fairly fleshed out online manifesto which spoke to, in some sense, some of the core mayoral powers that are held at that level. So, for example, wanted to set up a new transport authority, the Greater Lincolnshire Transport Authority, and plans to use the education budget on STEM, AI, and defence. Like with last year's election, though, there was also some elements of her manifesto which include areas outside of her remit, so some aspects relating to adult social care. It's possible that she might use her convening powers to kind of exercise that. I think, though, the most eye-catching thing that caught most media attention was Doge Lincolnshire, where she's planning to cut spending in councils within the authority. Again, she doesn't have direct control in that space, but are very much reliant on the sort of convening power of a mayor to do that. The other mayor, of course, is Luke Campbell. He is a former professional boxer. He's been elected to the mayor of Hull and East Yorkshire with 36% of the vote on an almost 30% turnout. Now, there wasn't as fully fledged a manifesto we could see online, but in terms of the priorities, he's been clear. He wants to hold councils to account on spending again. Fixing the bus network is a big priority, and securing more funding than the current devolution deal currently provides. I think looking across both candidates, 2 things really stood out. The first is that unlike some previous elections, there wasn't any candidates who went forward asking for the abolishment of the mayoralties. And so we've seen commitment from both of these 2 new mayors to further the mayoralty system. And also they've both been very strong in terms of their rhetoric, in terms of wanting deeper devolution and prioritising delivery. So I think now the real question to the both of them is how they're going to balance these ambitions for delivery with the often lack of staffing that happens at the very start of new mayoralties.
Thanks very much, Matthew. A number of themes I'm sure we'll touch upon in the conversation. I think also I was struck by the quite strong language on, I can't remember the exact phrase, end net zero madness, I think, from Andrea Jenkins, which could foretell or foreshadow some difficult relations between Dame Andrea and the government on that policy agenda. But I'm sure we'll come back to that shortly. Okay, so those are the 2 reform mayors that join our growing cohort of mayors across England. Meanwhile, in 2 other parts of England, we had the 3rd set of elections to existing mayoralties namely in the west of England and Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Sarah, tell us about those, and again, what happened in the elections, what we know of the 2 new successful candidates.
Yeah, thanks, Akash. As you mentioned, voters have elected their 3rd regional mayors in both the west of England and Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Their posts that have existed since 2017. Looking at the west of England, the Labour candidate Helen Godwin was elected with actually only 25% of the vote. She was previously a Bristol City councillor from 2016 to 2021 and was on the council cabinet. Although she hasn't actually produced a detailed manifesto, her campaign pledges were again around core mayoral powers and included things like improving the reliability of bus services, opening new train stations, and developing green skills in the region. Looking at Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, it was the major success story for the Conservative Party of this set of elections, and their candidate Paul Bristow won with 28% of the vote, again quite a small percentage. He was previously the MP for Peterborough from 2019 to 2024. And he was campaigning in the region since November. He has a much more detailed manifesto, and it sets out plans including on areas such as dual carriaging major A roads, improving the frequency and speed of train services, taking action on flooding, adopting a spatial development strategy as soon as possible, and commissioning an independent review of adult skills provision. Again, all key major mayoral powers. But zooming out and looking at these two regions together, a key task for both these mayors will be to work across party lines. As I mentioned, both mayors were elected on really quite small vote shares, with voters split significantly across 4 or 5 parties. In fact, in the West of England, 5 candidates managed to get 14% of the vote share or higher. And when you combine this with relatively low turnouts of 30% in the West of England and only slightly higher in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, questions may be being asked about the strength of each mayor's mandate. As we at the RFG have regularly pointed out, mayors don't have strong personal executive powers. Although they're able to set the vision for an area, successful delivery relies on building consensus among the leaders of the constituent councils who make up the combined authority board. Both regions are politically diverse and both have previously faced governance challenges, so it will be essential for both the new mayors to build strong relationships with council leaders of all political parties if they are to deliver on their election pledges.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Yeah, and as you say, I mean, both elections were notable for the multi-party competition, and as a result, yeah, as you say, both got sort of both of the successful candidates got under 30% of the vote, and as a result of the change in the electoral system that the last government made for mayoral elections. We just have now first past the post election rather than requirement to appeal for second preferences from other voters of other candidates. So I think it's interesting what that does mean for their mandate and their convening power, as you've referred to. So great. So those are the first the 4 mayoralties that were elected at the regional level. Want to now turn to the local elections. And Stuart, I mean, as I've already mentioned, Reform now are fully in control of 10 councils. They're the largest party and several more, as well as holding those 2 mayoralties up in the north of England. What do you make of their performance in those local elections, and what do you make of their plans and their proposals to cut waste, as they would put it, woke waste and so on in local government?
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit that I was quite shocked by the scale of Reform's wins. I'm not really a poll watcher or somebody who's sort of very plugged into a lot of the political sort of horse racing type stuff, but I think it was quite an exceptional in terms of unusual performance in council elections. To have added 700 councillors in one single election cycle is quite surprising, I think. And you heard from the Greens and Lib Dems and some frustration that they're being ignored in this, and the Greens point out they've got more councillors than Reform. But I think Reform done this in one election cycle, whereas the Greens have done it over many, many years. So I think there is something quite surprising and unusual about this. So that's the sort of the starting point, I would say. I think the other thing is that there's a reasonable argument that people have made, and again, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a poll person, but I think there's a reasonable argument that people are voting for parties out of a sense of frustration with the status quo, a feeling that that things just aren't working in the country, that things are getting worse in people's lives, and they're looking for an alternative, and that's led to sort of fragmentation of political of voting across the country. I think we saw it last year a little bit with Labour in the national election, and then you can see it now. People turning away from Labour because Labour have been in power for a year and things are not improving. So I think there's an argument that it's voters looking to roll the dice again and see if different party maybe can make any real difference. And Reform definitely pandered to that in their campaigning. We talked about Luke Campbell saying he wants to hold the local authorities and his combined authority to account for their spending. Andrea Jenkins saying she wanted to cut diversity and inclusion officers from the council staff, who apparently also don't exist. But that is maybe a different story. And then like Lee Anderson, who's an MP, promising to have Doge-style bodies. That's the Department of Government Efficiency from the US, style bodies in every council. So there's this real sort of populist push for the idea that if you just got good leaders into a council, you'd be able to make large savings and improve services in the area. And I think there are a few major problems with that. I think, first of all, it's just really hard to argue there's a lot of wasteful spending in local government. As context, we're now sort of 15 years after the point when central government massively cut grant funding for local government in the 2010s as part of the austerity programme, and that funding's never fully recovered. Per person spending power is about 20% lower in real terms now than it was in 2010 for local authorities. So just have far fewer resources. At the same time, the population's older, there's more demand for social care, there's increasing poverty, so there's just more complex demand for services as well. So in response, local authorities have cut swathes of services since 2010. There's a third fewer libraries than there were back then. They've closed leisure centres, they've cut spending on Sure Start centres. Even the statutory services like adult social care have experienced cuts to some part provision. There are fewer older people over 65 receiving adult social care now than in 2010. And I suppose the argument from reform would be, well, we could spend more on those frontline services if only we cut waste from, central spending in local authorities, things like the DEI officers that Andrea Jenkins talked about. But again, it just really doesn't stack up. So just out of interest, I had a look at the spending by Luke Campbell's local authorities on their central services. So that's things like, your council CEO, your analysis function, your finance function in central offices. And that's about 3.5 of their total spending in 2023-24, compared to about 61% of their budget being spent on adult and children's social care. So in other words, even if they cut, say, 80% of their central spending, it would be a minuscule increase in spending on adult and children's social care. And obviously that spending on central services is vital as well. It's for things like financial planning and for analysis of, where to direct spending most effectively, all that sort of stuff. It's really important for how local authorities are run. So this idea that you can just cut spending from central offices and improve performance is frankly just a bit of a fantasy. And I think they'll really struggle to make meaningful savings when they get into these councils. And then I suppose if they go and look for savings elsewhere, you're looking at big ticket services like social care, highways, housing services. And those are all things that they've promised to try and improve. And particularly on social care, if you start further rationing social care to older voters or older adults, those are some of Reform's core voters who'll be particularly unhappy to see services cut. So I think they're going to find real difficulties when they get into these councils to deliver the kind of things they said they're going to deliver. And then the other point I'd make is just that there's been an enormous turnover of councillors in this election. So obviously almost 700 new councillors out of 1,600 Reform. So they're new, they're going in, they've never done this before for the most part. And they're replacing councillors in some places that have been doing it for years. And they understand how the system works, they understand how local authorities run. And these are very complex organisations which manage very large budgets and deliver vital services to people. So I think it's going to be a real sort of learning process, teething process for these councils when they get into the councils to actually work out how they can try and make change happen, what the councils actually do, what their powers actually are. And it's going to be a lot of work for officers, the sort of civil servants within local authorities, to actually onboard these new members and to make sure they understand how they work and how to get the most out of councils. So yeah, I think it's pretty seismic for those local authorities that have seen changes in control at the elections last week.
Great overview and analysis of the challenges facing those hundreds of new Reform councillors. So great to see lots of questions coming in online, which we will come to in due course. So do please continue to suggest questions for us on the panel. I'm going to go on with some other questions of my own for my three colleagues. So we've started talking about the impact of the elections locally and for the communities that have elected these new local leaders. I'm interested now to turn to the implications for the government, for its agenda, for what it wants to achieve. So first of all, Matthew, what do you think the election of these new mayors, 3 or 4 out of 4 of whom, of course, are not Labour, as well as the prospects, I suspect, of more non-Labour mayors being elected next year and beyond if the government goes on with its plans. What do you think all that might mean for Labour's plans for and attitude towards further devolution, which ever since last July and indeed before the election too, is really talked up as a key part of its agenda for government? I think that might change. How do you see this playing out?
I think I see it playing out in a couple of different areas. I think that overall there's a risk that it could stall potentially. I think that'd be the high level take home. In the first instance, the government created these devolution priority program areas, which was originally designed to sort of freeze in place the leadership that were going to, in areas that are going to be coming forward with future mayors. And although there haven't been elections underway there, I think we can anticipate that local leaders will be looking to their neighbouring county councils and starting to consider what happened there and what their own political futures could be. So it's possible that the conversation might change slightly in the areas at the front and centre of the government's agenda for extending mayors across England. I think also the government's made a firm commitment to extend devolution more broadly across England, and there's a real risk for those wave 2 areas that it could stall. Now, I think the case in point to look to is, say, in Lancashire. Now, the county council election occurred there. Reform UK are now the largest party, and it's still not clear quite what their commitment will be towards mayoral devolution. It also could have changed the attitudes of some of the district councillors as to whether they want to go forward with a mayor, if it could potentially end up with a reformed UK mayor. Now, that obviously will affect whether the government gets to deliver on its ambition to complete the map of the North. There could be cases where it goes slightly the other way. So Sarah, as our West of England correspondent, was looking at the potential for the heart of Wessex. Most of the councils there are now run by Liberal Democrat leaders, with the exception of one in Swindon who's run by Labour. Now, what that means is that potentially the political alignment might ease some of the conversations that are underway there. So looking slightly further ahead, that might be slightly easier there. But I think that what this says, though, is that till now, the government's relied on sort of a vibrant local conversation and a buy-in from the bottom up. It's possible it might need to dip into the ministerial directive power that it was wanting to put into the English devolution bill to resolve some of the bits of the map that aren't yet complete. So we'll see whether that also becomes a bit of a wedge issue between new political leadership at the local level in Reform UK and Labour centrally. So it could be, you could quite imagine issues of identity, and the notion of a local area's identity being a potential way of really politicising a topic. But I suppose very final thing to say, zooming out more generally, given the amount of power that's now moving down towards local level, and given some of the difficulty that might occur in terms of extending it across England, you might see changed attitudes at a central level with some of those departments and ministers who are less on board with the devolution agenda, potentially saying, look, if that's what's happened in these elections, do we want to really be engaging with it? So I think we'll have to see how that conversation plays out centrally too.
And just in terms of the devolution priority program areas, you mentioned that program. There's 6 areas or regions on the program. Do you want to say a bit more about where we're up to in those places, and whether any of those devolution discussions might potentially be disrupted, bearing in mind that in all of those places the local elections were postponed, so we haven't had a change of leadership of local councils in those places, obviously.
Certainly. So the long-term aim is to have mayors in post in a year's time. In May 2026, that's what these areas are aiming for. However, in the absence of that particular ministerial directive power that I was mentioning earlier, what the government's had to do is it's had to advance in terms of the legal framework. It's had to advance based on the existing statutory powers, and that requires the sign-off of all of the leaders or the councils within the particular area that's pushing forward for a devolution settlement. Now,
the upper tier ones, at least.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the upper tier ones. So obviously, if you are a local authority where you look like you might be switching to reform in the future, that might change some of the incentives that are operating, and you might potentially want to maybe not go down that route. There's also been, and I'm sure we'll come on to local government reorganisation soon, although they're two separate things, they've become quite conflated because depending on what footprints emerge at the local government level, that might affect the number of votes that occur on the board level. So you might see potentially we've seen it already in some discussions to date where areas are trying to identify the best footprints that could lead to electoral success for them. That isn't what we should be looking for in this. We should be looking for other criteria, and the government's quite clear what that should look like. But you could see that could lead to some quite different types of discussion at a local level.
Absolutely, no, going to be really interesting to watch. And as Matthew's, as you just mentioned in passing, Matthew, until and unless the government changes the primary legislation, which it said it's going to do with a devolution bill at some point to be published before the summer, hopefully, unless that does change the law, these new deals can only be implemented with unanimous agreement locally. So that's often been a stumbling block in the past, including in some of these DPP areas, certainly in East Anglia, in Hampshire, in Sussex. Previous attempts to do devolution deals have foundered on the rocks of local opposition. So yes, I think some interesting political obstacles ahead for the government. Okay, yeah, so let's move on, as suggested, actually, to the parallel but separate local government reorganisation plans that the government has kicked off in all the two-tier areas of England. So, Sarah, do you want to talk us through, I mean, what is the plan there? What are the next steps? And to what extent might those election results change what happens in your view?
Yeah, so far the government has received what it's referring to as interim plans from all councils. They're kind of their initial ideas and options for what the future of local government might look like in their areas. They're now waiting for councils to work on their formal statutory plans, which will ideally set out one or maybe potentially a few options that they've narrowed down to. The areas that are moving fastest with this are the areas that are on the devolution priority programme, as well as Surrey. But as Matthew mentioned, local elections was postponed there, so we haven't seen changes in leadership last week. I think what's more interesting to look at in terms of the elections last week were the non-priority areas. So these are areas such as Oxfordshire and Kent. These councils have now inherited interim plans from their predecessors, and the government's expecting them to submit these formal proposals by November this year. This is a tight timetable, and as Stuart has mentioned, these are often councillors who don't come in with significant experience, who will be facing the demands of having to come up with plans for what local government looks like in their areas. The government's also been really clear that district and county council leaders should be working closely together to submit one joint proposal and business case in November. So it'll be interesting to see whether new councillors can come in and quickly build the relationships needed to do so. Looking at sort of the more party political angle, the Liberal Democrats so far have strongly opposed the government's reorganisation agenda. And although Reform UK's position is not yet clear, it also has the potential to be a significant disruptor. As Matthew was speaking about on the devolution side, local government reorganisation could also be used as a wedge issue, and it could cause significant friction between central government and the councils involved. To achieve its plans for large-scale reorganisation of local government based on the criteria that it wants, the government may end up choosing to take a stronger approach. Under the Local Government and Public Involvement in Health Act 2007, the Secretary of State can implement alternative plans to those that the council submit, although doing that may require the government to use significant political capital. Finally, looking ahead to the coming years, once the geographies of future local government have been decided, the task will be then to implement them. As research by Matthew and I earlier this year found, strong local relationships, both between district and county councils and incoming and outgoing authorities, will be absolutely essential to successful delivery. The organisational challenges of local government reorganisation can't be understated, and strong collective leadership is crucial. If councillors instead choose to take a disruptive or combative approach, this could be a real threat to the success and sustainability of local government.
Yeah, thanks. Good plug there for my colleague Matthews and Sarah's report, Dual Delivery, highly recommended to all listeners. So Sarah, one other question I'll put to you now, actually, because it's one that's currently top of the leaderboard in our online question rankings. Is, well, part of it we've already answered actually, but the specific in the counties where elections were postponed this May, or counties and a few unitaries actually, will elections take place in May 2026, which is currently the legal position, or will they be postponed again? What do we know about or think about that?
That is an excellent question, and one that we have been having lots of discussion about ourselves. I think it's really important to say the government has been really, really clear that local elections will be going ahead in May 2026 in these areas. As that stands, and from what we understand of their timetable, in the devolution priority programme areas, it seems that it means that May 2026 elections will be to outgoing county councils. Then in May 2027, there will be shadow elections to the new unitary authorities, with them looking to take on powers on their vesting day in 2028. There is a possibility that some areas could move faster than that, particularly if you're looking at new unitary authorities on the same footprint as county councils and also Surrey. And in that case, the May 2026 local elections may be being replaced with the sort of shadow elections to the new unitary authority. Of course, there is some scepticism about whether they are willing to do elections to outgoing authorities next year when they didn't hold them this year. But I think the important point to make is exactly what Matthew was talking about in terms of freezing leadership. In comparison to the areas I was talking about where elections haven't been postponed and a change of councillors may be really shaking up local government reorganisation plans, these areas have had the benefit of stable political leadership through the next year, which may be crucial to the success of mayoral devolution and local government reorganisation in these areas. So as it stands, it looks like May 2026 elections will be going ahead unless you hear anything else.
Yes, indeed. I mean, that's certainly been the government line, and that is the legal position. I think in a lot of those places, maybe privately, there is a bit more skepticism that we've picked up. So I think you'd agree with that about whether in practice it will make sense if by May 2026 it's been agreed pretty much these councils are about to cease to exist. We now know what the new footprints of unitary authorities is going to be, whether they'll really go ahead with elections for bodies that will then be wound up within the next 12 months. I think there's a bit of past precedent for a first postponement to be followed by then another, cancellation essentially, because councils were then ceasing to exist. So definitely one will be watching to see if there's another pushback or indeed cancellation of those elections. Okay, so moving on from the devolution and local government plans, I mean, I think another interesting question is whether these changes of leadership locally, regionally, might make more difficult the government's plans in other and really more politically important areas, or in their pursuit of other political objectives around house building, around growth, around net zero. Stuart, how do you see this playing out?
It's also an interesting dynamic that's sort of emerging now. And yeah, as you say, in particular, the government's mission, growth mission and mission for net zero, I think could be affected by this. And on the former one, particularly the push for more housing and their house building target. Reform have made very clear that they heavily oppose net zero. I think Richard Tice tweeted after the election something like, we now control the mayoralty, the county council of Lincolnshire, and he's an MP in Lincolnship, and we will fight you every step of the way on net zero developments, things like solar farms, battery storage systems, like building pylons, that sort of thing. So it's clear that Reform are heavily opposed to this, and that is obviously difficult for the government. It's hard to have any opposition in local areas where you might want to be implementing something that is sort of crucial to your political platform. And as Reform gains more and more power, that it'll sort of increase the opposition gradually across the country. But I think there are a few things to unpick that I think are worth bearing in mind when we discuss this. The first is that for large net zero projects, they are covered, or they're known as nationally significant infrastructure projects. In other words, they are vital to the government's goals, or they're large enough that the government has identified them as that. And in those cases, councils have no control over planning, and national government instead can overrule local areas, and they can impose those projects on an area. So obviously that is far outside the power of any Reform council to deliver. They can't stop those projects from going ahead. They can launch legal challenges to those projects, which I think they might do. There's a possibility that they'll review those in the courts. And while there's probably little chance they'll win those reviews, it will just slow things down. It allows them to sort of score political points as they say, we're fighting for local people to prevent these kind of projects. So there is that possibility. The second thing is that planning is the responsibility of district authorities, where there's a two-tier system. So we have county councils as the upper local authority and district councils, the lower local authority, and then unitaries in the place where it's a single-tier system. And there were no district elections last week. So a lot of the county councils, things like Derbyshire, Kent, Lancashire, and Lincolnshire, where Richard Tice is an MP, they're all upper tier local authorities who don't have any control over the planning system. So there's little they can do there to control the amount of house building that goes ahead. They can put pressure on districts, I suppose, but they don't actually hold the planning competency that district councils have. So Reform didn't win any district councils. They don't hold any councils, any lower tier councils that have that power. They did win unitaries in County Durham, North Northamptonshire, and West Northamptonshire. So that's more important there, but that's still a relatively small part of the country overall. The other thing I would say is that it's hardly like Reform have replaced councillors or councils that are massively pro house building in the first place, or like to sign up to and align with the government's agenda. With the exception of Doncaster, which was a previously Labour held council, all the councils that the Reform Party won were previously held by the Conservative Party, and I can't imagine they would be massively supportive of the government's agenda on these things anyway. And even other councils like Cambridgeshire and Oxfordshire, which the Lib Dems won, are also like to be quite resistant to house building targets and any developments for net zero purposes, because that's just the way that those parties operate at a local level. They tend to be quite NIMBY-ish. So I'm not sure that Reform are particularly more NIMBY-ish than other parties at a local level. One other area I think that potentially could be a flashpoint and maybe not critical to the government's sort of objectives is asylum accommodation. Reform has said it won't accept asylum seekers to be housed in their areas. And again, that's not in their control. That's the Home Office that decides where asylum seekers are housed. But again, they can fight the government in the courts, and they can make a big political row out of this, and they can, point to it as central sort of diktat deciding where asylum seekers are placed around the country. And as we saw last August, that can lead to some real sort of flashpoints of unrest in certain situations. I think maybe like the final thing I would say is that, and this is probably incredibly politically naive here, I'm going to say it anyway, but I would imagine a lot of Reform voters we've discussed were motivated by a feeling of dissatisfaction with the fact that nothing changes. And they've probably also been quite affected by the housing shortages and high housing prices, and would benefit from a programme of house building. So if Reform wanted to actually differentiate themselves from other national parties, you could argue that they could push ahead with choosing to build more houses and claiming that as a win for themselves as well. But I suspect that is politically naive, and they will probably be as NIMBY-ish as most other local parties.
I mean, you've talked about local planning there, and the fact that it doesn't sit at the county council level. I mean, I think there's also an interesting question about, well, it's not just about the impact of the elections last week, but in general, how difficult it is going to be for the government working with regional leaders to create spatial development strategies. So these are regional spatial plans that it has said, the government has said it wants to see in place everywhere in England. And wherever there's a mayor, that's going to be, at least in the first instance, the responsibility of the mayor to develop. But under current legislation, those plans can only get agreed with the unanimous agreement of all members of a strategic or combined authority, though that again may be changing as a result of the devolution bill. But yeah, I mean, even if broadly speaking, Reform or any of the parties might say yes, they're in favour of house building, I think where you need unanimous agreement around the regional strategy, it's just inevitably going to be difficult to get through. I mean, which is why the Institute for Government has for a while called for a move away from unanimity and just a requirement of majority support within a combined authority to implement those strategies. But yeah, nonetheless, that's going to be another really crucial thing, I think, for the government if it wants to make progress on its housing and infrastructure and indeed net zero objectives. All of those things are affected by regional planning, but we wait to see how simple, if at all, it is going to be for it to make progress. I don't know if you have any further reflections on that one, Stuart.
I'm not really on top of the spatial development side of things. I think that's more the sort of you guys. But I would bang the drum for the sort of the capacity of the planning system to absorb large amounts of additional house building. So even if the government is successful in getting proposals for house building projects around the country on the scale they want, I think there's a real issue about just who is processing these planning applications in local authorities. Planning is a service that is delivered by local authorities, and therefore it is subject to the same financial constraints as every other local authority service. And there's been a real difficulty since in the last 15 years in particular of hiring enough planning officers to actually sort of get through the backlog of planning applications as they stand already, let alone if you then have a large influx. And there are real issues like they lose them to the private sector because the private sector pays more. There's just not many of them in the country as it is. So I think there's an element that the government has to, make sure local government has the capacity to actually support and deliver its sort of nationally important objectives.
Yeah, which goes back to the points you were making earlier about the very threadbare state of central strategic and administrative capacity in local government in the first place, let alone before it starts taking on new functions like regional planning. Okay, great. So yeah, please do keep sending in questions. I'll take a couple from the audience now, actually, because there's some interesting ones popping up. So first one, well, we had a bit of a chat about the change of electoral system already. There's a question from someone anonymous. Is there any prospect? This might be a one-word answer beginning with N, but is there any prospect of the government changing the system for mayoral elections from first past the post back to what it was before, supplementary vote, or some other system? We've suggested maybe alternative vote, if you were going to change it, could be a good option. I certainly think it might be. Sarah, what do we know about the government's thinking on this issue? Is there any prospect of a change, do we think?
From what we know, no, there isn't. The government hasn't expressed any interest in changing the voting system for mayors. I think the results where they only won one of the four mayoral elections this year may make it politically challenging for them to do so now. They haven't marked their territory yet. So I think it will be really difficult for them too. I think one interesting thing to note was that except when they won the mayoral election in the west of England, Labour didn't come second in any of the elections. So even if these elections had been under the supplementary voting system, it wouldn't necessarily have resulted in Labour mayors. So that might give them a tiny bit of political leeway. But beyond that, at the minute, no, don't think there will be any change in the system.
Doesn't seem like it's really on the agenda. Okay, one other question, also from Anonymous. This could be the same anonymous person asking dozens of questions, or many people, we don't know. One for you, I think, Matthew. What accountability structures are in place for central government to hold combined authorities and mayors, I suppose, accountable? And is there anything missing that could become riskier after the local election results? I'm not quite sure of the implications of the second clause of that question, but yeah, tell us a bit about the accountability structures and how those work or don't.
So the accountability structures vary slightly depending on what level of maturity the now mayoral strategic authority, I keep wanting to call them mayoral combined authority, but mayoral strategic authorities are at. The most advanced, those that have an integrated settlement, and that's West Mids and Greater Manchester, they have a very particular outcomes framework where they're being held to account for particular delivery of particular service lines for a very big pot of money that they've been given. But that doesn't apply in these very particular cases. In the cases of the most newly established ones, typically the controls are a bit tighter. So most of the funding comes in sort of a bilateral relationship with given departments where they're expected to deliver against certain programs. And so often you hear the mayors complaining that that's quite, there's not enough freedom for them to actually exercise their leadership. And in certain cases, particularly, for instance, the adult education budget, there's a whole year that the new combined authority has to implement existing spending plans before they actually get to then actually choose how they're going to spend their money. So often there's a fairly good line of sight from the centre down to mayors. However, the real limitation in the system is there isn't really good functioning at a local accountability process at a local level. There are oversight and scrutiny committees, but when we've done work before on this previously, it's shown that actually these are typically very poorly resourced. They lack prestige. People don't often turn up to them. So it means that actually holding mayors and the combined authority board to account can be quite difficult. It can also be really messy to work out actually to what degree has this bit of money come from the local level via the mayoral precept, to what degree is this from the centre, who's responsible for which bits of money, and even how decisions have been made. So there's a lot of sort of complexity in the system. In terms of if there's anything missing, well, I mean, we've previously made the case for the need for some form of local public accounts committee. That would be a way of increasing the prestige, and also potentially getting some different types of resourcing at a local level for that. We've also called for more of an accountable officer system, similar to the one that operates in Westminster, and that would see the leading officials in the combined authority being held to account personally for the decisions that are being taken in terms of value for money and other sort of good hygiene, I suppose, really, spending practices. But even then, the rollout is quite complex. So I think in terms of the second half of the question about what's missing, I think that, yeah, there are structures and processes that could be put in place, but I think there's still a little bit of work that needs to be done on that.
Quick follow-up that someone's asked, I think, prompted by what you were just talking about, Matthew. What do you think the election of the Reform mayors what do you think that with the impact of the election of Reform mayors will be on the maturity of combined authorities in the eyes of government and the government's willingness to move towards that integrated settlement model for more places, which in principle it said it wants to do, but there are conditions attached and so on. So how do you think that might play out?
I think very much it'll be shaped by how well these organizations get off the ground. And core to that is something that actually Sarah flagged earlier on when talking about Cambridge and Peterborough, whether there's goodwill, whether everyone's pulling in the same direction, and actually is the resourcing going into place to actually set up this new regional tier of government. I think that, so you've got two aspects to that. One is, are the relationships going to lead to a mature discussion, and can we see a level of cooperation that's occurring at a local level? That is going to be a bit challenging in one or two of the areas, potentially. Take, for example, Hull and East Yorkshire. You've got the one vote from the Reform mayor, but you have 2 votes from the Liberal Democrat leaders in Hull and 2 votes from the Conservative Party in terms of the East Riding of Yorkshire. So if the political leaders enter into this without the right spirit of engagement, the type of spirit that actually Andy Burnham called for when speaking at the IFG last month, for place-based leadership, seeing what unites people rather than what repels them, then you could easily see discord. That could lead to a bit of stagnation. And without the right kind of tone from the top, you could easily see that translating into a lack of direction. And that could then affect the maturity of the systems that need to develop. Because let's not forget that although, congratulations, tick, these areas now have a mayor, they may not necessarily have the really deep processes in place to look like a credible organisation to interface with Whitehall. So it really will require all of those political participants and the officials operating with them to really pull in the same direction and say, can we get in place the level of maturity in our systems to demonstrate the credibility so that, 18 months down the line, when we start to become eligible to run for integrated settlement, it's an inevitable answer. We can say, yes, this is a really viable candidate. And as I've sort of emphasized repeatedly in this answer, that really requires everybody to, in some sense, put aside the politics, focus on the place-based leadership and say, actually, how can we collaborate?
Well, yeah, and I mean, we've talked a lot about reform, and a lot of the questions we're asking about reform, but it's very important to note, I think. I mean, the other 2 mayoralties, namely Cambridgeshire and West of England, in some respects, those have been the 2 most troubled combined authorities since they were created. I mean, both were put in sort of special measures by the government, best value notices being issued and so on, due to organisational and political dysfunction. I don't think it's putting it too strongly, under both Labour and Conservative mayors and in the past, and that reflects a lack of what, Matthew, you've just been highlighting is absolutely crucial to the devolution model, that collective cross-party leadership that's based on the interests of the place rather than partisan advantage. And for whatever reasons we could go into if we had more time, that's been hard to come by in those areas. So the new Labour and Conservative mayors in those 2 places are going to face just the same kind of challenges as the Reform mayors. And indeed, the flip side, in the now Reform-led areas, is going to be incumbent on Labour and Conservative and Liberal Democrat council leaders to work with and, to some extent, support the mayor who has come in with the mandate, with the to lead the region as a whole. So, I think these challenges to make the system work really fall upon all the parties. Matthew, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I just want to say very briefly that conflict is not inevitable. And I think we can look to what's happened in Tees Valley, if we can have a look to what's happened in the West Midlands Combined Authority, where typically the mayor doesn't have the same political affiliation as the rest of the Combined Authority board. This is by no means saying that this is an inevitability. Actually, as you're saying, there'll be hard political decisions. Hull and East Yorkshire being a case in point, the leaders of both Hull and East Riding of Yorkshire both ran to be mayor and didn't get the role, but they've got enough skin in the game. They are politically invested. They signed off the bid to go to government on this. Actually, people can pull together, and I think that that's where potentially a place-based approach might be the route forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. So we've got time for a couple more questions at least, I think. So just scanning through it. Stuart, here's a question for you again from Mr. or Ms. Anonymous online. Do people, meaning voters, have a clear understanding, do we think, of what local government actually does as opposed to national government? And, well, relatedly, how will reform handle having relatively few levers to pull on some of their hot button issues like immigration? Well, we've said a bit about that already, but yeah, over to you.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one that I had for you yesterday, actually, when we were discussing this about mayoral competencies. It's something that I talk about when with local government services all the time. I think there's a very poor understanding amongst the public, maybe not to be too disparaging, but I think a lot of people don't fully understand or grasp like the full extent of local government powers and services they have to deliver. Often you hear, oh, there are so many potholes, my bin's only collected once every other week. And that's understandable because those are the universal services that everyone in a local authority interacts with to some extent. It's that, everyone gets their bin collected. I think but that also ignores the fact that local authorities provide a lot of other services that are to some extent invisible because they're to a much smaller proportion of the population. So for adult social, the two biggest services they provide are adult social care and children's social care, which together account for about 70% of local authority spending. But those are provided to very, very small proportions of the population. For adult social care, it's only to about 1.5% to 2% of the adult population receive social care. So you're unlikely to receive it. Maybe you know someone who receives publicly funded adult social care, but that's not a guarantee. And I think that is sort of borne out by polling. There's polling that shows that about 40% of people think that the NHS provides social care, for example. So I think that feeds into this feeling of frustration amongst people who or residents of local authorities, where they say every year my council tax goes up by 5%, 5%, 5%. I'm being charged ever more, but services get worse. My high street is rubbish. I get fewer bin collections. There are more potholes, and it sort of feeds a sense of frustration or a lack of a sense of nothing changes in politics, which I think is understandable. So what can Reform do about it? I think they're gonna run into some of the same problems as every other party, which is they're gonna probably have to put up council tax to be able to fund some of these services, or else make very harsh cuts that we've sort of discussed earlier on. And unless they're exceptional political communicators in a way that other parties have proved not to be, they'll also struggle to communicate how the pressures on them and their finances are not met by the level of funding they receive from council tax and central government. So I think they're going to run some of these same problems. I think maybe where they're probably more able to sort of play politics in a different way is to get to the second part of that question, which is they will start to play the blame game, the sort of populist. This is because central government doesn't fund us effectively. This is because we're spending all this money on asylum hotels. Probably the second bit is not particularly true, but that doesn't really necessarily prevent them from saying those things. So I think they'll maybe fall back on some more populist rhetoric to justify it, as opposed to other parties which are more sort of measured in the way they discuss these things, but arguably still don't communicate the challenges particularly well, I wouldn't say.
Okay, so we are almost at the end of our time. So I think I might just put one very final question to, well, I don't mind, Matthew or Sarah. Do you want to, one of the issues we've talked about quite a lot with these elections, not just this year, but generally the mayoral elections, is the turnout trends that we've seen and whether it matters that relatively small share of the population is actually showing up to vote. Either of you want to quickly say some words about that? Sarah, go for it.
Yeah, so looking at the turnout of the elections this year, they were about 30%, and that's actually the same as last year. But turnout in some areas was notably low. For example, in the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough election, turnout in Peterborough was only 26%. I think one point to make here is that there weren't any other council elections in Peterborough. So whereas turnout was higher in Cambridgeshire, up to 38% in some areas, that was where they had the county council elections going on. And so we seem to see that voters turn out better for mayoral elections when they have other things to be coming out to vote for. And I think to some extent, this also explains the decrease in turnout in the west of England. So in 2021, the turnout was 36.6%. That was down to 30% this year. But in 2021, there were also elections for Bristol City Council, the single authority mayor of Bristol, and police and crime commissioners. So I think there's really important work to be done in terms of really clearly communicating what mayors are, why you should be turning out and voting for them, and what their powers are. And turnout will remain a really interesting and important issue.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we're going to have to draw it to a close there, but thank you to everyone who tuned in and submitted questions. Sorry to those we didn't find time to answer. And thanks very much to my colleagues, Matthew Stewart and Sarah, for all their insight. Look out for more IFG events over the coming months on Devolution and lots more besides. And yeah, thanks all for joining us.